All right, so today I have a special presentation on the Young Idealist. I've invited the Canadian philosopher and scholar Matthew Nini to come here to talk about his upcoming book on Fichte, um, Fichte in Berlin. Now, interestingly enough, in German idealist scholarship right now, we're going through a kind of renaissance of Fichte studies. A lot more interest is coming out through Fichte. So this is why I have Matthew Nini here, Dr. Matthew Nini here, to discuss his new text. And so Matthew Nini has obtained a PhD from McGill University in 2022 with a thesis on Fichte. He is currently a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Freiburg, and his first book, Fichte in Berlin 2024, has just been published with McGill-Queen's University Press. And that's why Matthew is here today. So Matthew, welcome, and thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me, Chris. I'm a fan of the channel. I like what you do, and it's a real privilege to be here.
Excellent. So I'm just gonna introduce the text from a write-up from the actual what's on the publisher's website. So in Fichte in Berlin, Matthew Nini breaks with a scholarly consensus, arguing it was there that Fichte finally reached maturity. And the only way to understand Fichte's mature philosophy is to perform it for oneself. The book focuses on the philosopher's 1804 lectures on the Wissenschaftslehre, an untranslatable neologism for his theories on the pursuit of insight, claiming that they are one of the most exemplary versions of the philosophical project that Fichte reconfigured some 17 times throughout his life. While the 1804 lectures offer a more robust approach, they remain faithful to the insight at the heart of the original philosophy. Fichte's work always emphasized the practical over the theoretical, and his 1804 work goes even further. To think with Fichte is to bring one's own philosophy to life. Nini guides the reader step by step through the complex arguments Fichte made in 1804 and goes on to examine some of his other works produced in their wake, arguing that Fichte's output from 1804 to 1806 is his first Berlin period forms an organic whole. So I've had a chance to go through about 2/3 of this book. It's fantastic, and I think it will be one that both students and scholars will return to in the coming years for Fichte scholarship, especially around this era of 1804. So I guess my first question to you is, also coming from similar family tree here, being a Schillingian, there's many faces of Schelling, and it looks like there's many faces of Fichte too through his Wissenschaftslehre. I guess my question to you is, why the 1804 period? Why is this Berlin period so interesting to you, and why do you think scholars now are gravitating towards this Berlin period?
That's an excellent question. It's a big question. I think I should start by saying, sort of reiterating something that you've said, because it's very important. And it's that there are many Fichtes, and yet at the same time, there's only one Fichte, and he emphasized that his philosophy stays the same. So this is the paradox. You have this philosopher named Fichte, who rises to fame in Jena in the mid-1790s with an idea, a sort of philosophical system called the Wissenschaftslehre. This is very difficult to translate, especially since the German word Wissenschaft doesn't quite correspond to English science, but we traditionally translate this as something like the theory of science, or the theory of knowing, or the doctrine of science, or the doctrine of knowing. And this is more or less Fichte's word for philosophy. And he winds up producing, over the course of his lifetime, about 17 versions of this work. Sometimes it's a book, sometimes it's a series of lectures. More often than not, it's a series of lectures. And each time it's different, and yet each time it's meant to be the same. And so we could almost kind of quip, and I think I write at some point in the book, or maybe in a paper somewhere, that for Fichte, to repeat is to make different. So that's also something And traditionally, we kind of see a sort of break in Fichte, or at least a huge kind of turning point, what we call an Übergang in German, a transition from the first period in Jena to the second period in Berlin. And so this is very important when we look at Fichte scholarship, especially in English, because we have this conception in the English-speaking literature. And all my respect goes out to my teachers, the English language Fichte scholars. I'm thinking especially of the late Daniel Brazil, who passed away in December, who left us. And Dan was such a magnificent scholar, Fichte. But for Dan, it was very clear that Fichte's great contribution to the history of philosophy begins when he arrives in Jena. He becomes professor at the University of Jena in 1794. And it ends when he leaves Jena in 1799. And after that, it becomes a series of obscure private lectures that talk about religious topics or theological topics, that talk about the absolute, which is a term you won't see in Jena. It talks about God, which is a term that you really won't see in Jena. It talks about all of these more speculative ideas. And so there's almost around 1800 when Fichte leaves Jena, where he had been professor, for Berlin, where he will spend the last 14 years of his life, more or less. A speculative turn where the language changes and the Wissenschaftslehre comes into dialogue in a way with what Hegel is doing and what Schelling is doing. So there's a real transformation in German idealism from being closer to Kant, being very transcendental, to, on the one hand, with the late Wissenschaftslehre, with Schelling's identity philosophy, and then, of course, from 1807, 1806, 1807, we have Hegel's very famous phenomenology of spirit. And if the young Hegel in the late 18th century, early 19th century is kind of a sort of neo-Kantian theologian, he's very much a speculative philosopher, a German idealist in the proper sense, after the phenomenology of spirit, or after the Jena system a little bit before. So for Fichte, this is a big speculative turn. And I think that one way of seeing it that's very helpful, even if this is not exactly the most nuanced way of seeing it, is a way that's put forth by Reinhard Laut, who was the general editor of Fichte's collected works in the 20th century, the Gesamtausgabe. And Reinhard Laut had a very strong interpretation of Fichte on the continuity side. And what he says is that the Jena Wissenschaftslehre, especially the first version, which is called the Foundations of the entire Wissenschaftslehre, the Grundlage der gesamten Wissenschaftslehre, is like, precisely as the name implies, a foundation. It's the groundwork for Fichte's thinking. And then he sees the 1804 as a sort of philosophia prima, which is a term that he gets from Aristotle, which is basically a synonym for metaphysics or theology even, or first philosophy in the Aristotelian tradition. So that's kind of the top. Because you have in the 1804 the concept of the absolute, and you have this absolute that looks a lot, in some ways, like Aristotle's self-thinking thought. This noesis in Aristotle thinks itself, and that's its activity. And so that's completely the other end of a philosophical system. Now, Fichte would answer Reinhard Laut by saying, it's not like I wrote an introduction and then I wrote sort of another chapter that focuses on something else. He meant both of those books, that is Fichte, the Foundation and the 1804, to be different iterations of the same thing. But this one is much more comprehensive in terms of being a philosophical system. It presents itself as a philosophical system, and that's what I like about it.
Well, thank you very much for that very thoughtful presentation. I guess my next question, which is highlighted nicely in your introduction of your text, Fichte has this ongoing project, so over 20 years, 17 works, and he's still adamant about the same insights following through his works. Do you think that the dismissal from Jena had any relation to this change? You highlight very nicely, in the beginning of the intro, the movement from the ich and the nicht ich and the Anstoß, or sorry, the I and the not I, the check, to things like the absolute and God. And so do you think that this dismissal from, 99, I think it's 98, to Berlin makes Fichte start to maybe rethink certain things that he left out, or maybe that he wanted to rethink through this moment in his life, I guess, this epoch?
That's one of the questions I was hoping you'd ask, because it brings up a subject in the history of German philosophy that I think is so important and still needs to be worked on. And that's the question of the atheism controversy, which is the reason why Fichte left Jena. He leaves in 1799 in the summer, but the whole process begins the year before in 1798. And I think this has an enormous impact in Fichte's thinking, in his life, in the questions that he develops. The question of religion, of course, is one of the central ones. So just kind of to quickly go over this so that the listeners have an idea of what we're talking about when we mean what we mean by this. The atheism controversy is one of the big disputes in philosophy in the late 19th century. If not the biggest, after the pantheism controversy of a few years before, although they kind of come together. And what happens is Fichte is accused of atheism by an anonymous tract written ostensibly by the father of a student at the University of Jena. And this is inserted into an ongoing philosophical conflict that he is having with other people at the time. So Fichte was the co-editor of a journal at the time, and they received a submission in 1798 that by someone in Freiburg that was an incredibly kind of deist, Enlightenment conception of philosophy of religion and of God. And Fichte read this and thought, we're going to publish this. This is a legitimate submission. And in those days, they were not in the habit of just rejecting things out of hand. Something would come, something would be by another scholar, you would publish it. And if you didn't like it, you would debate it. And so Fichte does precisely this. And he publishes an essay, which is one of his first forays into the question of religion very explicitly as an answer to this deism that's put forth by Freiburg, which is sort of a very cynical kind of deism. It's not very appealing. It kind of says, well, we should sort of behave as if there is a moral lawgiver, and that as if is sort of good enough. And Fichte answers saying, no, there is ground for our belief in a moral lawgiver. And this comes out in a text called the Divine Governance Essay. Now, all of this gets sort of confused in the public reception and in the public perception of this, because Fichte and his fellow editor, Niethammer, look at these texts and they say, oh, well, we don't want people to think that we're cynical deists. So let's put the response, Fichte's essay, first. And this just causes no end of confusion. You have basically parents complaining that their children are being taught atheism. Fichte always had a sort of free-thinking, freewheeling style. He would give lectures on Sunday afternoon in his house, which was something that was not allowed. It made it look like he was founding his own church, which he was not, of course, but it gave a certain impression. And all of this builds up and builds up and builds up to the point where you have riots in the streets in Jena, and you have student protests and petitions and conflicts involving the major political powers and players and dukes and archdukes, and Goethe writing letters to people to see if Fichte can be reinstated or not. And Fichte does not help himself in this whole matter. It becomes a political issue, and he continues to fight a philosophical battle in a very stubborn way as it goes on. And so the culmination of this is he's dismissed from his position. He refuses to capitulate and to say that maybe he should retract certain texts or apologize for writing anything. And so he sells his house. He borrows money from the poet Friedrich Schiller in Weimar. He gets in a coach and he moves to Berlin. And his initial response to all of this is a text called The Vocation of Humankind, the Bestimmung des Menschen, which is kind of taken to be a sort of continuation of Fichte's philosophy of religion, because there you go from a sort of some of Enlightenment ideas about moral lawgivers and Kantian ideas to a book that is structured according to three moments: knowing, doubting, and faith. And so this is the beginning of something new. And then, of course, the Wissenschaftslehre, Fichte's theoretical work, his philosophy, has to catch up to this. And it's not only a question of religion, I would say, it's also a question of the atheism dispute led to basically every major intellectual in Germany at the time airing their discontent with whatever they didn't like about Fichte's philosophy. And so he needed to give more than just a rhetorical answer, which is what the vocation of humankind is. It's kind of a very beautiful rhetorical answer to his critics, but a real philosophical answer needed to come. And there are a number of false starts. You have a draft of the Wissenschaftslehre in 1800 that he doesn't even finish. You have a Wissenschaftslehre 1801, 1802 that is not really satisfactory. And then it's only in 1804, during the second attempt in 1804 to give a series of lectures, that he really settles on a text that he copies out in his own hand, that he's thinking about publishing, and that really cements a lot of the concerns that are going to accompany him for the 10 remaining years of his life after that. So I would say that in a way, 1804, the text that I mostly deal with in my book, is the mature philosophical answer to the objections made during the atheism controversy.
Thank you for that lovely answer. And my question was really feeding off something that you had initially stated in the introduction, which is, the Jena period, the Jena Wissenschaftslehre, the first versions of it are almost in sync with the foundations of the entire Wissenschaftslehre, and along with the lectures on the new method. And then there's this leap in 1804. This is why I asked you that previous question. Maybe one more question for fun, just because before we move into the kind of meat of the text, because I'm a Schillingian and I'm gonna, poke some jabs at you here for a second. There's this really great line, really great area in the intro, I think towards the end, where you write about Fichte being less a teacher than a guide, and he wanted to, in a sense, and this makes Fichte a great professor and philosopher for doing this, and wanting for each of his students to arrive at the truth by means of their own work. So why do you think at this time there is such a head bashing between Schelling and Fichte over nature philosophy and transcendental philosophy? Schelling is obviously from 1795, is extremely Fichtean, even the essay on the Ich, the I, all the way to some of the portions, I would say the system of transcendental idealism. But Fichte is still, okay, you got some parts right, but no. So why do you think he has such a big problem with Schelling's presentation if he wants to guide his students to their own path through his science of science, I guess?
It wouldn't be the kind of discussion it is and the kind of forum it is if there wasn't some Schillingian jibes at Fichte at some point. But that's a very generous way of approaching it, because head bashing is that's kind of the word, because when you look at when Fichte arrives in Berlin, first of all, who takes over in Jena as the philosopher in Jena when Fichte leaves? Schelling. And this is what the greats wanted. You know, Goethe says at one point during the atheism controversy, Fichte's star is falling, Schelling's star is rising. That's as much a political as a philosophical remark, but what it leads to is Fichte, newly arrived in Berlin, trying to get a grip on what he thinks on his own system again, after kind of being washed up in the tides of controversy. And just at that moment, what's Schelling doing? Schelling is inaugurating what will become the identity philosophy. And so Schelling is working on a text and will publish a text in 1801 called The Presentation of My System. And this sends Fichte off the handle. This had nothing to do with the Wissenschaftslehre. How can you be a student of transcendental philosophy and write something like that? How can you think the things you think about nature and the system of transcendental idealism and still call yourself a transcendental philosopher? What kind of a philosophy is this that thinks about intuition in that way as well? Because you have this development of the idea of intellectual intuition. Intellectual intuition, in a way, is, if Schelling can run with it so far, it's Fichte's fault, because it's a somewhat vague term in the Jena Wissenschaftslehre. But it's Fichte's term. And then Schelling picks it up and runs with it and makes it the center of a very, very interesting dynamic philosophy that's very different from the Wissenschaftslehre. And so in their correspondence between 1800 and until it breaks off and they stop talking to each other, like I want to say late 1801, early 1802 might be the last letters, Fichte just keeps bringing back the same charges to Schelling to say, that's not the role that nature plays. This is not what it's about. Why do you keep talking about being? We're transcendental philosophers. It's about seeing. It's about foundational arguments and the conditions of the possibility of something being or not being, and not what it is and where it comes from and its nature. For Fichte, like for many other people in Germany, Schelling was going back to Spinoza. And Spinoza was a hot button topic. This was very controversial. And this caused a rupture in the relationship between master and student, where in a way, Schelling feels that he's becoming the master, and with right, because the Presentation of My System of 1801 is a beautiful philosophical work. But Fichte can't stomach it. But now I'm going to say something that's going to please you very much, Chris. And I'm going to say this is going to be the point where the diehard Fichteans might slam their computer screen shut in outrage at what I have to say. Because I think during this period, there is still a very strong mutual influence between Fichte and Schelling. In Germany, I know that Laura Hühn would agree with me, now retired from the University of Freiburg, here where I am as well. But if I think of, God rest his soul, if I would have said this to Daniel Brazil, or if I would say this to others, they would kind of look at me and go, that's a nice thought, but how eccentric. I think that if you take the 1804 and you look at what Schelling wrote the same year, a text called Philosophy and Religion, and you put them together and you look at them, you see such an approach, a common approach, common interests, points of convergence. It's not the same philosophy. Let that be said. But you could almost say that from the Jena Wissenschaftslehre, you have convergent developments from the foundation of the entire Wissenschaftslehre. If you think it through creatively, intellectually, independently, you can get to Schelling's identity philosophy. You can also get to the Berlin Wissenschaftslehre. Or you can get to Friedrich Schlegel, or you can get to Novalis, or, So that's kind of my look. I'm working on Schelling, and I see more and more convergences all the time. Even this question, last thing I'll say about this, even this question of Fichte being more of a facilitator, kind of trying to make you have your own insight. In his 1821 lectures in Erlangen, Schelling says things that he could have been taken right out of Fichte's mouth in 1804. Listen and pay attention. Do what I do. Construct the system for yourself. It sounds so much like Fichte. And that's Schelling in 1821.
This Berlin period has to be, is immense on many philosophers. But one in particular that I would never have thought of when I heard this quote, Hegel stated, I don't know when, maybe in the 20s before he passed away, that when he dies, he wants to be buried next to the great master Fichte, which is so interesting because of the different shrift where he kind of just, characterizes Fichte as the subjective idealist. So I think now that we've kind of introduced some of the concepts, we can now move to the middle of your book. And you've divided the book into, the 1804 Wissenschaftslehre with the theory of truth, the theory of appearances, and then the second part is Fichte's talk on the present age and the principles of and the doctrine of God and his work towards the blessed life. So maybe we can talk about some of these concepts, like what is light in Fichte's 1804 philosophy? What is the absolute? And then from there, I have some more questions about the 1804 text.
So if we just take the concepts that you mentioned, the first thing that has to be said, and I kind of broach this point in kind of the preface or the introductory remarks to the first part. Fichte is struggling from the time he arrives in Berlin with the question of language. How do you express the Wissenschaftslehre? Because all throughout his career, going back to the Anisidmus critique before the first Wissenschaftslehre, going back to the insights that his philosophy is based on, it is an insight, a spontaneous insight that occurs, and that's what Wissenschaftslehre means. And then you have to somehow unpack that in language. And that's the whole problem of having to go through 17 different versions of this, where you have to figure out a way to communicate this that doesn't destroy it through communicating it. So in 1804, and this is one of the points that readers of this text find very difficult, there are different streams of metaphors and different sets of language that are used to describe similar phenomenon or the same phenomenon. So if we take light and the absolute, first of all, the absolute is meant to be sort of an ineffable principle. This is the first thing you notice when you read this book, is the reader who knows Fichte's early work, who might have gone to lectures on the early Fichte. Here in Freiburg, where people get a good, solid foundation in the history of German idealism, they'll do the classical thing where they'll have to read some of the foundation of the entire Wissenschaftslehre. Then they're on to Schelling. And then when they look at my stuff, they say, well, where'd the I go? Where'd the I go? And what's this absolute principle? I thought that that's what Fichte was against. The answer is that the I is not really the absolute. What's happened is Fichte has tried to take away language that seems too subjective, because this was one of the criticisms that comes up in the wake of the atheism dispute. Is this a solipsist language where I am my own God because I am the only thing that exists in my universe? There's a joke that Heinrich Heine makes in his history of religion and philosophy in Germany, where he kind of portrays the salon conversation of people in Jena or in Weimar talking about the Wissenschaftslehre, and people saying, Fichte thinks his I is the only thing that exists. Does he believe that his wife exists at least? this was kind of the joke. But what you have in 1804, and he says this kind of in the middle when he gets to the really distinct part of the theory of truth, the really decisive part, the foundation of the Wissenschaftslehre was never the I. The I on its own, the concept of an Ich, was never meant to be the foundation of a whole philosophy. What you had was a self-positing I that is brought up against, in contrast with, what is not itself, the Nicht-Ich, the not I. And it must, because we're talking about transcendental philosophy where I do not have direct access to knowledge of things in themselves, my knowledge of that comes through subsuming what is not I into this movement of the self-positing I. And so you have the I, the not I, and the sort of positing movement to which they both belong that becomes the totality, the threefold totality of the foundation. So what Fichte reminds us of in 1804 was that the foundation of his philosophy is something called the Tathandlung, which is a German neologism that brings together the words for act and fact. So Tathandlung. And there's this act of positing, this act of knowing and being present to what I know when I know it, comes to describe a sort of absolute relationship in 1804. You might wind up asking a question about the Soll, which is a term I don't translate in the book later on. But this kind of is a great kind of door to the absolute and to understanding Fichte's absolute in the sense that the Soll says that whenever there is a structure of knowing, or rather, whenever there is something that is known, it is known according to the structures of knowing. This relational principle, this is Fichte's absolute. The concept of light is really great in this text because it has sort of it plays multiple roles. It helps us kind of go through a dialectic process that brings us to understand what the absolute is in the first part of the lecture. So if we say that, you know, the first part is a theory of truth and the second part is a theory of images or a phenomenology, so lectures about 1 to 1415, the hard part is making understand what he means by the absolute and how it is pure activity, esse in mero actu, and not anything, and certainly not anything that reveals itself as itself. It only reveals itself through images, that is, through other things, and we are these images. So what's going on is ultimately a play between immediacy, immediate experience, and then thinking things through in concepts and language. So in the first part in the theory of truth, you have this opposition between light and concept, and that's where the light idea, image comes to us first. And there, what it means is fundamentally to sort of be at home in the light, to intellectually and humanly, phenomenologically, to inhabit one's experience. Then you have to explain this. So light will come to be throughout this image of what it is to sort of be in the absolute or be in one's experience, and to have the conviction that one is living whatever one is living, whatever that experience is, whether it's something very banal, you know. I see, you know, classic Fichtean example from the Novo Metodo Wissenschaftslehre. Look at the wall. I see the wall. I think the wall, and I think that I'm thinking the wall, and I cannot doubt that I'm thinking this. There's an immediacy to that knowing that I'm thinking that light is supposed to help to describe. And this brings me to something you might not have asked because it's kind of an obscure part of the book, but you can stop me if you had a big question about this that's going to come up. Is I sort of describe the sort of light concept relationship on a higher level using terms from Fichte, but that I've kind of adapted. He uses a term called evidence that is translated in the English translation by Walter Wright as manifestness or being manifest. I don't like that, so I decided to use the German and use it as a technical term, evidence, because I like the rapprochement with the English evident. Your experience is to you in its immediacy something that is evident. Light shines and something is in the light. And so evidence is a very, very important word for me to interpret here. But where light sheds light, as it were, on evidence, now I'm starting to talk like Fichte. Don't let me do this, Chris. Don't let me get away with that. But what light sheds light on is the fact that when something is in the light, physically, when you turn the light on in your room, when the sunlight shines in to a room, it makes things visible. But you cannot see light. Light is not an object of perception on its own. It enlightens things. And too much light, and this is an image in philosophy that goes all the way back to Aristotle, who says we need owl eyes in order to see. The owl sees best when there's just a little bit of light and it's blinded by too much light. If you stare at bright light, you will be blinded by it. You will only see brightness. But if you have just enough light, it will enlighten, shed light on objects. And this is the point of the absolute and the light metaphor. You cannot look straight into the absolute. It will burn your eyes like looking at the sun, or you just won't make out anything. You know, you guys in North America got to see this beautiful solar eclipse that we missed in Europe. And you could see it as a Fichtean moment in a way of no longer being in the light, of the condition of the possibility of your experience not being there. And so in the same way that kind of this I, not I relationship is sort of this possibility condition that makes all experience possible because it all exists within that relation, that's the light as well. Things are in the light and they're visible.
I just wanted to make a kind of sarcastic remark about the solar eclipse, because as, of course, being a Torontonian and living in Toronto, we didn't see anything. The clouds just blocked all of our vision. We just saw everything gradually dim and get extremely darker. I like that we've talked about light and this idea, because now we can move into Fichte's theory of appearances and theory of truth. And there's sections of this in your book as well, too. So can we maybe revisit the concept of what is Fichte's theory of truth now? What is truth in regards to the Wissenschaftslehre of 1804? And how does this relate back to a theory of appearances, as we were just talking about light in a second, the light, kind of disclosing certain things for us.
So then, writes Fichte in lecture 15 of the 1804 Wissenschaftslehre, so then, on a particular occasion, I divided the science of knowing, the Wissenschaftslehre, into two main parts. One, that is a doctrine of reason and truth, and second, that it is a doctrine of appearance and illusion, but one that is indeed true and is grounded in truth. The first part consists of a single insight and is begun and completed with the single point which I now present to work. So this is what Fichte says right before he reaches kind of the absolute middle point. And the point he comes to, and here I'm going to read one sentence or two of my book that sums this up. On page 66, I write, at the beginning of lecture 16, Fichte reminds us of the results of the theory of truth. Thought, or consciousness, became aware that it shared its content with truth in itself, and hence an absolute dynamic oneness, esse in mero actu, was identified as the absolute. So what does this mean? And what does this mean for this theory of truth and for these two parts? The first 15 or so lectures, lecture 15 is kind of something in particular, this middle point, but the first 14 lectures for sure, we could call the theory of truth. And then from 16 to 28, we have a theory of appearances, or a theory of images, or a phenomenology, depending on how you want to call it. Fichte uses all three terms. I like phenomenology, phenomenologie, for reasons we'll get into. But to get back to the first part, the theory of truth is supposed to begin with our experience, our very sort of pedestrian experience of what it means to have knowledge, to be a knower, to be a philosopher, as it were, aware of one's knowledge, and moves up to the absolute as the possibility condition for all knowing. Now, what does that mean? We talked about the absolute as light and how light enlightens things and sheds light on things. The idea is, in order to know anything in particular, the structures of knowing have to be in place. All the conditions need to be met for something to know. And Fichte goes through this idea and gets to the bottom of it by saying, well, ultimately, the process of knowing is this structure that is pure activity, that knowing is always an activity, and that this activity in a very restrained way will belong to me whenever I engage in the act of knowing. Now, at some point, in a move that absolutely dizzies the scholar of Jena, Fichte, he will say, no, this is not an I that knows, this is a we. And what's the point of that? The origins of this, like the light image, we could trace back all the way back to something very early in Kant, in his correspondence with someone named Lichtenberg, very appropriate name, so Licht, light, and Lichtenberg, upon reading what Kant was writing, said to Kant, well, you've written this sentence, this famous sentence about the conditions of knowing, which is the I, das Ich, must be able to accompany all of my representations. Very famous Kantian sentence from the Critique of Pure Reason. Das Ich muss alle meine Vorstellungen begleiten können. Lichtenberg says to Kant, why do you call it the I think? Das Ich denke muss, sorry, das Ich denke muss alle meine Vorstellungen begleiten können. Why do you say I think? Why not say, since it's an act that has subjective and objective moments, it thinks, es denkt. And since it's not a sort of continual stream of me constantly being in full possession of knowing and all of its conditions, but potential and then something that is actualized in particular instances, why don't you say es blitzt, flashes of knowing? And so there's something very Fichtean about that already, about this exchange between Lichtenberg and Kant about the Ich denke, not the Ich. The Ich, I was being too Fichtean for a moment, the Ich denke. And this is where the theory of truth really kind of kicks into high gear, when you realize that your thinking reproduces the structures of knowing every time you think. And those structures of knowing come from the absolute that you cannot know as an object, but that you strive to know as an object, and that you have to seek to know as an object in order to understand that it is not an object. And so that's where the really, really fun part comes in the Wissenschaftslehre 1804, in lecture 15, where you have the basic principle, Fichte says. And the basic principle I would summarize as this: you do not possess knowing. Knowing possesses you. And that is kind of the kernel of Fichte's answer to both Jacobi, with whom he had a long-standing conflict during the atheism dispute, and Schelling on the other hand. And you will say this to both of them as a means of saying, this is what transcendental philosophy does. Jacobi thinks that there's a gap between God as he is in himself and our knowledge, and that we just need to make a leap of faith, a salto mortale, in order to know God. Fichte will appropriate this idea and sort of rename it what he calls a projection through an irrational gap. It is completely irrational in a way to conceive of the absolute as Fichte does, first at presupposing it, which is what you do with objects, because this moves you away from what you want to talk about. The absolute is the foundation of our knowing, and yet objects are farther away from this. You want to move backward, but you're moving forward. And yet somehow Fichte says, suppose that there is this thing called the absolute that is the foundation of knowing, or suppose that when you are aware of your knowing, you are really aware of it. When you know, there is also awareness of knowing that comes together. This leads you to objective knowing, but yet somehow this process evokes in you a question, which is, how do I know that this is true? Where does this come from? From where do I speak? To put this in the term of, I think, one of my favorite Fichte scholars, someone who teaches in Ottawa named Isabelle Thomas-Fogiel. I quote her in the book, I cite her, she brings out something that Fichte says very explicitly, and when you look at the way she deals with it, you think that's obviously Fichte's position, but before she highlighted it, I don't think it was really well known. And that's that the Wissenschaftslehre is really ultimately about the conditions for what you say being compatible with what you actually say. Tun and sagen, doing and saying. And so you have to do something. The Wissenschaftslehre is a practical philosophy. You have to say something, and then you have to realize that, look at whether or not the conditions for this line up. And the ultimate result of this, and now I'm going to jump into the second half, is that you realize that you are, as a knower, an image of the structures of knowing. Now, the point is, and what Fichte will latch onto, is this image of character, this abbilden, abgebildet. Image of what? Well, the theory of truth doesn't really say, and that's where you wind up going into a theory of images, to say, well, the foundations of knowing is esse in mero actu, pure act itself, shining light, whatever you want to call it. But that's not something you can know, and that doesn't really tell you all that much about the structures of knowing. Then you actually have to put it in practice and do something. And that's where the Wissenschaftslehre becomes, again, what it always is supposed to be, a performative philosophy, something you do. Your thinking about your thinking becomes the catalyst to arrive at a theory of knowing. And so the point is, and here is where Fichte uses a very tricky term, the soll, that I evoked earlier. And I'm going to reiterate what I said about it earlier and briefly expand on it. The soll basically says that you reproduce the structures of knowing every time you know something in particular as this sort of flash, as Lichtenberg would call it, a sort of blitz. Now, as structure, the soll is not something to which you have immediate access. Now, Fichte goes through this long deduction to arrive at what he thinks it sort of looks like, but the point is, you have what he calls categorical soll, which is the structures of knowing as it knows itself, soll als soll, shining light. You insert yourself into this every time that you know something. So your particular knowing, the knowing of something, is a hypothetical or problematic. He says it's translated as hypothetical, but in the German it's problematisch, problematic soll. And what this means is that you somehow are missing some fundamental structure of knowing when you know something, in that the structure of knowing is self-reflexive. And it loses its absolute self-reflexivity when it moves towards some object. And so the whole point of the second half will be to move through a very long, tortuous argument to basically say this: the hypothetical problematic soll is derived from the categorical, fully self-reflective soll. Let me say this in English, because Fichte in the very, very interesting lecture 23, which is near the end, he kind of says, okay, so if you're not getting this, let me give you another perspective. Let me talk about certainty. What does it mean to know something certainly? What is the certainty of your knowledge of particulars in the world? How do I know that I'm sitting in my office in Freiburg? And this sort of goes back to David Hume looking back at the history of philosophy and saying, oh, well, this is all habit and custom. How do you know this? And then Kant saying, there are subjective conditions of knowing, and there are these things called synthetic a priori propositions. And I can show you through all of these things that you do know something with a certain certitude. And Fichte's answer to this is to say, certain knowledge, knowledge that is certain, is always knowledge of a certain thing. So this is the particular that reveals the whole structure of knowing. The way I interpret this, and kind of the conclusion that I come to in the book, is a sort of very German idealist pronouncement that sounds a little strange at the beginning, but hear me out. We, and the we here as opposed to the I is very important, we are reason. What does that mean? That means that this whole kind of normative structure of what reason is, all of the norms of knowing and understanding, all of the ways that we make sense of the world around us and we bring it into language, we carry all of that within us. It's not a structure that exists as something entirely outside of us, but rather we are sort of, to speak theologically, and Fichte does use this language, the sacrament of reason. A sacrament is a visible sign of something invisible in Christian theology. And Fichte will say that the human mind, the human person in the activity of knowing is the visible sign of the invisible absolute that is the light, the structure of knowing, the certainty that is self-reflexive.
There were two things that I wanted to bring up. First, as you were talking about this whole structure between consciousness and object or self-reflectivity, it sounded a lot like, for me, Hegel's argument from sense certainty to perception, that consciousness is always conscious of an object. There's always this structure. And secondly, these are not questions, these are just thoughts. When you said we don't possess knowledge, knowledge possesses us, this sounded oddly Heideggerian to me. And then as we started moving into light, I kept getting these moments from being in time where you hear the lightning flash and conscientiousness when the call of the conscious comes to Heidegger. Are there connections between Heidegger and Fichte, do you think?
People in the German literature, there are some articles on this. In Heidegger's work on German idealism, there's not much time spent on Fichte. Schelling is his guy in the German idealist period. Look, I'm sympathetic to that. I live in Freiburg. I live in the clearing, as it were. And there are differences there, but there's a rapprochement that could be made there. So if graduate students who are listening now, you could write a lovely paper or a master's thesis or something on Fichte and Heidegger in English, it's underdone. Although I would caution people to say, when you get to a certain point, you realize that there's a very strong emphasis on consciousness and self-consciousness in Fichte that Heidegger has moved beyond. Now, you bring me to the Hegel thing, because and here's a Canadian link. There is a really great Hegel scholar of a bygone generation. I think he died maybe 20 years ago now, if not more. Henry S. Harris, H.S. Harris, who wrote these big commentaries on Hegel, who was professor in, I'm going to get this wrong, but someone can correct in the comments or something. He was professor in Kingston, Ontario, at Queen's University, or I forget where H.S. Harris was as professor. Harris brings out what he calls Fichte's Verdienst, Fichte's duty, Fichte's contribution, and ultimately the Hegelian idea of self-consciousness, that consciousness is always self-consciousness, is Fichte's idea. It's Fichte's contribution to German idealism. Because remember, Hegel doesn't read past 1800. He read the Bestimmung des Menschen. There was no Nova Methodo Wissenschaftslehre text. The Fichte's philosophy was the first Jena Wissenschaftslehre, and then people got these kind of popular books on religion, on morals, on ethics, on things. And so that's what Hegel knew. So what does Hegel, this very brilliant reader of the history of philosophy, pick up on? That, consciousness is always self-consciousness, and vice versa.
It's funny that you brought up H.S. Harris. H.S. Harris actually taught for, I think, the majority of the end of his life at York University, where I am.
That's where he was. He was in York, sorry.
No, it's all good. I think he may have been at Kingston as well, too. And he is like a leading figure in the whole North American kind of disclosure of German idealist thought, especially on Hegel. So it's interesting that you bring up him, because my teacher of Hegel, James P. Vernon and Howard Edelman, always brought up H.S. Harris. I mean, always.
My teacher as well, George DiGiovanni, who has a really, I need to say this very quickly, that George DiGiovanni's book on Hegel that came out with Cambridge University Press a year and a half ago now, Hegel and the Challenge of Spinoza. My book is really kind of an answer to the Fichte chapter in his book, and George is very indebted and openly indebted to the great work of H.S. Harris. So this is, we could call this, if I can kind of brazenly say, the Canadian school, even if he was an Englishman, but many years in Canada, the Canadian school of German idealism.
Yeah, or the great Canadian idealists, you know, Taylor, yourself, Harris, Beckenheim. I mean, this great list of tradition, you know. Yes. Now, what is really interesting, I mean, other than Kierkegaard, Fichte has this kind of, you pivot and move into 1805 and 1806 towards the end of the book. I haven't finished the full text, but I'm almost there, and I will finish it. Fichte's talk on the present age. This really was important for me, the ideas here, because so many philosophers have talked about what it means to be a philosopher in their own age, to be a thinker that is struggling, fighting with, or trying to interpret their age and not to live in the past. This is this kind of false nostalgia. So what is it about the so-called present age that Fichte feels he's doing? What is he trying to grapple with here in his own present age, I guess, with his work?
First of all, give some context, kind of the content of the book, and we're pivoting to the second part of the book now, which is not as heavy as the first part. Although the principles, the text and the principles that we might discuss later was a pretty tough read. So the book is called Fichte in Berlin, not just because it's the 1804 two lectures on the Wissenschaftslehre that's kind of the heart of the theory, but my idea was that the lectures on other things that Fichte gave in Berlin in the years following are influenced by this, and that they kind of continue what I call the phenomenologies. So you have this theory of truth, and then you have this kind of movement of carving out a space for what it is to be a subject in Fichte's worldview. What does it mean to be a Wissenschaftslehrer? And one of those elements is that your actions take place in time. And I think that's the kind of takeaway from this series of lectures. It's called The Characteristics of the Present Age. They were given alongside a very difficult version of the Wissenschaftslehre, 1804-3, so the third version in 1804. It's not translated. It's It didn't work out so well. Fichte himself seemed very convinced that 1804-2 was, if there was one of these to be published or distributed, would be that one. Is the third run into some troubles that we won't take some time to talk about. But while he was doing that, he also decided, I'm going to make a comeback. I'm going to do something that gives me more notoriety. So he rents this hall in Berlin, and he publicizes this widely. And he decides he's going to give lectures on what it is to be a philosopher or to be alive in this age. And it looks like a philosophy of history. It's sort of that. Fichte famously was not interested in history for much of his career. And the sort of historical structure of this text, when I think about it, of course, you read a book, you want to get into Fichte's mind, you try to be generous. But when I take a step back, there are things to criticize about this text. And it sort of belongs to a Germanic tradition of dividing history into the past, the present, and the future in a sort of a priori way. In a movement, if you want to understand the mood behind this, you read a poem by Schiller called The Gods of Greece, Die Götter Griechenlands. And there you have this beautiful line, schöne Welt, wo bist du? Where are you, beautiful world? Kehre wieder, turn back. So there's a golden past. Today is a time of moral bankruptcy and corruption and decadence. And then tomorrow, in the eschaton, in the time of salvation, there will be a return to something great. So it's kind of like Christian salvation history coming into the temporal realm. And so Fichte is kind of describing the journey of the philosopher according to this pattern. What I retain of it is that time is the field in which subjectivity engages in free action. You have to be free for Fichte. This is very important. If you're going to start to do philosophy, the starting point needs to be absolutely free. You decide to do philosophy. And then, very famously, as he says, the kind of person you are determines the kind of philosopher you become. Part of the meaning of that is you will reproduce the Wissenschaftslehre in your own words. You will arrive at the truth, but you can arrive according to your own path. And this only happens as a subject who is free in time. And that's what I retain out of that series of lectures. Which also contains some really kind of mean jabs at Schelling, who was having a lot of success in Würzburg at the time.
Well, there has to always be shots at Schelling. You know, you brought up Heinrich Heine, and it's funny because Heinrich Heine has so many wonderful shots at Schelling, you know, that Schelling's whole movement of thought is like the whirling dervish after spinning around, doesn't know left from right. Marx famously called Schelling a salesman of ideas. So I mean, these are great shots. So where did the doctrine of God emerge, and why is this finally happening in Fichte's philosophy? I mean, this goes back to the whole atheism controversy. I'm sorry, I apologize for cutting you off, but it seems like when you start writing about the principles of the doctrine of God, and then morals, and then rights, and then finally towards a blessed life, there seems to be this religiosity that's emerging in his philosophy, and I'm wondering what is bringing up this interrogation with religious ideas and the conception of God.
So this is very interesting. I'll just say a quick word generally about kind of God in Fichte, and of course you kind of have God in Jena, but you don't have a philosophy of religion, and you don't have somebody called God who might be the equivalent of sort of an absolute principle or das Absolute. In a footnote or kind of in a side note in 1804, he sort of says, oh, this is the absolute, call it God if you like, and then he keeps going on. Then in 1805, you have this preoccupation with God and the idea of God that comes up as one of the spheres of philosophical thinking, one of the objects of philosophy. And by the time you get to the 1807 Wissenschaftslehre, where he is in Königsberg, he is giving the Wissenschaftslehre in Kant's city, and you would think he would be more transcendental and more kind of self-restrained than ever. But here he starts talking about not light and experience, or not evidence or transcendental terms, or no return to the I. He starts talking about light and shadow. And this is a very kind of eruption of theological terms in the Wissenschaftslehre itself. Now, before that, these lectures in 1805 are the sort of an early speculative treatment of this idea of God, even if it's not, I wouldn't say that these lectures are about God, but they do treat the idea of God as one of the central concepts. Now, this is a series of lectures that Fichte gave in 1805 called The Principles of the Foundations of God, Morals, and Right, or Law. And it's kind of difficult to know exactly what these are, because they're not the Wissenschaftslehre, he doesn't call it that, and they don't do exactly the same thing that the Wissenschaftslehre does. But yet they're not any of the sciences that Fichte says the Wissenschaftslehre is supposed to be the foundation of. So he says on different occasions, in 1804 at the end, in the Nova Metodo, he'd already said this at the end, oh, well, what's the Wissenschaftslehre for? If it's a kind of a theory of knowing, or the knowing of knowing, or what good is that? He says, well, that gives us structures of knowing that we can use for other sciences that are more restrained. You've got religion, you've got Sittenlehre, ethics, you've got morals, and you've got nature, which he never really got to because it's, let's face it, it wasn't very high up on the list. Even if nature is necessary in Fichte's system as kind of the, how should I say, the ether in which everything swims. It's there, but it's the thing that contains things, and Fichte doesn't necessarily see it as containing of its own much content for self-consciousness to talk about. It's the place where self-consciousness is, and self-consciousness is the interesting thing that's in nature. So what do these lectures do? First of all, they were not published until the 1980s, because Fichte's son, who edited the critical works, the first critical edition, the Sämtliche Werke, looked at them and thought, these are telegraphic. These are keywords that would have been elaborated in discourse, and I don't get them. So they're only published in the 1980s, and let me tell you, it was very difficult to work through this German text of very obscure keywords. But I came up with an interpretation, and the core of my interpretation, I'm going to read a sentence because this is what I have to say about it. The main point of these lectures is summarized in the foundational synthesis, the Grundsynthesis of lecture 19 and 20. Knowing has an absolute structure, the absolute or God, embodied by spontaneous intellectual activity, morals, Sitten in the broad sense of the concrete activity, in the spatio-temporal realm, right. This material is largely elaborated out of lectures 22 to 25 of the 1804 Wissenschaftslehre. So this is kind of a continuation of Fichte saying the absolute has a face, and this is us as knowers. And so what does this actually do? What does this look like? How does this take shape in the world? And it takes shape of God being an absolute structure to which we belong, of morals, Sitten, kind of ethics, you know, in terms of the things that we do being our free activity as knowers, and then this taking place in a spatio-temporal realm, which is right or law. And that's what's going on in these. But they're very obscure. I mean, not many people have written about it. The only other secondary literature I've found is by one of my favorite Fichte scholars, Marco Ivaldo, an Italian. Professor Ivaldo, those who know Fichte know that Professor Ivaldo seems to be able to read these things from having spent a lifetime with Fichte.
It seems like the later work of Fichte that we've been discussing presents Fichte as a very public philosopher, a philosopher from the vocation of the scholar, vocation of man, his addresses to the German nation, and these later lectures as well. How important was it for Fichte to transition from, I guess, an academic philosopher, a philosopher from Jena, now to a very public persona, dealing with these issues that are these present issues, and addressing an audience with I guess, in a sense, from the vocation of a scholar, his language is much more public. It's much less academic. How important was it, or did you think he felt that using less nomenclature would still get across the same ideas of the Wissenschaftslehre?
This is, I think this is one of the best questions someone can ask about Fichte, is how does the popular philosopher and the theoretical academic philosopher and one hearer in Berlin who heard the characteristics of the present age and heard some of the criticisms on Schelling, and also was going to the Wissenschaftslehre on other odd days of the week, said, when understandable, when comprehensible, mean, nasty. When theoretical, incomprehensible. And that is it represents, as a sort of nasty joke, the issue that Fichte has reconciling two things that are very close to him. To explain this, let me quickly go back to something I may have already told you, but I love to say this in lectures because this is something that kind of contextualizes it for all the German idealists. If you look at this text, it's called The Oldest Systematic Program of German Idealism that we know. There's this presentation of theoretical philosophy and then aesthetics somehow being the door to a popular philosophy that everyone can understand. And for Hegel, it seems clear to me that that is the encyclopedia. He makes his philosophy popular through the encyclopedia, or so he thinks. It's meant for a broader audience because it's a genre for a popular audience. Schelling does this with myth. You look at the Ages of the World, or even earlier, and Schelling is writing the mythopoetic and trying to be Dante, trying to present a speculative philosophy that is also a myth of a people. If we had to apply this to Fichte, even if Fichte is older and kind of is, in some way, the inspiration for the oldest systematic program, Fichte's would be the sermon. Fichte, his whole life, sees himself as a sort of philosophical preacher, which goes with this conception of religion, where kind of religion needs to be brought up to philosophical language, and Luther is all about, Christian revelation is brought to us in the highest terms, and so theology develops as well, like other sciences. And so Fichte, already in Jena, he is lecturing in a private context outside of the university, something he does every time he gets a job. He had 3 academic positions in his life: Jena, then in Erlangen in 1805, and then in Berlin he becomes, in a grand return, spectacular comeback, he becomes rector of the University of Berlin when it's newly founded in 1810. And so in 1794, in 1805, and in 1811, you have a series of lectures called On the Vocation of the Scholar, where he presents the Wissenschaftslehre. You can tell the content is inspired by the Wissenschaftslehre. He presents the Wissenschaftslehre as a way of life, and being a scholar as the highest human calling. This is something that goes back to Aristotle again. The happiest of people is the philosopher. And Fichte gets in on this with these popular lectures already in Jena. Now, when he gets to Berlin, the things that I'm writing about in my book are mostly lectures that he was giving in his house, which was not unusual in the early 19th century, especially since Berlin did not have a university. But this would have made him think, oh, who's my audience? So the Wissenschaftslehre has to be adapted to his audience, and then popular lectures need to be adapted to what he, as a teacher, thinks people need as intellectual and even spiritual nourishment. And so when we get to that, I'm going to quote something from the Anweisung zum Seligen Leben, which is the part of the book that is at the end, and so you might not be there yet in your study of it. But this is where the Wissenschaftslehre finally gets the theory of religion that it would have needed to defend itself in 1799, where in a move that I think disgusts a lot of Jena scholars, or did of the past generation, the Wissenschaftslehre all of a sudden come to be presented in the language of the Gospel of John. Now, the thing about that is Fichte sees religion as a science, as people did in the 19th century. It's Wissenschaft. And for him, it is the highest science after the Wissenschaftslehre, which is self-reflective science, science of science. So then the question is, if religion is science, which is not how we usually think of religion, what is it the science of, and why is it the highest science? And in my interpretation, I would say, the highest science for Fichte is religion, because religion is a science of discourse that lets you say what you think with real felt conviction. And because the absolute foundation of what you were able to think has a relationship with God that is not yet determined in 1804, but will become much clearer in the coming years, this is religion. So here's Fichte's very interesting definition of religion from 1806, from The Way Toward the Blessed Life, his philosophy of religion. Writes Fichte, but religion consists precisely in the facts that one, in one's own person, and not that of another, with one's own spiritual eye and not that of another, should immediately intuit, have, and possess God. That's religion for Fichte. Now, this sounds a little bit like Kierkegaard, doesn't it? Because that's not, if you ask a Christian theologian what's religion, they're not going to say, well, it's about your existential relationship to the idea of having internalized God. No, they would say something about belonging to a Christian community. They would say something about faith, the pistis of St. Paul. They would probably go in another direction with it, but not so Kierkegaard and not so Fichte, where they kind of bring an existentialist turn. And so here's the kind of proto-existentialist moment of Fichte's phenomenology, where he says that religion is to be inhabited by God in a way. And so remember what I said about we being the sacrament of reason. This sacramental structure will come out when Fichte goes on and on and on about chapter 6 of the Gospel of John, which is the famous bread of life discourse, where Jesus says to his disciples, if you do not eat my flesh and drink my blood, there is no life in you. And of course, Fichte will maybe push this in a little bit of a strong philosophical dimension and say, well, what that ultimately means is Jesus is sort of a philosopher of the Wissenschaftslehre, and you should be a Wissenschaftslehre in his image, and then you will be his flesh and blood, and you will externalize this. But there's something very strong about the Christian idea of the imago Dei here, of being the image of God. And basically what Fichte does is he comes along and he says, on an external level, we have to philosophically justify this concept of the imago Dei. How is it that you cannot be God, but be the image of God, God's image and likeness, to use the Christian language? And how can you do this? Because he is a person of subjectivity. This is the 19th century. This is post-Cartesian, post-Kantian philosophy. How am I to possess this in my inner forum? And so religion really is what comes to let me feel at home in the light, to say what I feel from the heart. Because Fichte, this goes back to his engagement with Kant in the late 1780s, in the early 1790s. He's trying to reconcile head and heart. He loves the idea of a philosophical justification of freedom. He loves the idea of freedom for all people, the ideals of the early French Revolution of liberté, égalité, fraternité. And yet he sees in the philosophy of late modernism determinism, mechanical determinism, Newtonian physics everywhere. And so Kant will help him reconcile the heart and the head. And the Gospel of John will help him reconcile this too, with the Wissenschaftslehre being the head, and then the Gospel of John being this expression of the heart. The expert on this question is my friend David Wood. So I'm going to plug a David Wood who lives in Bonn, who is one of the great living Fichte scholars, I think. So David, if you're watching, post something on Fichte and the Gospel of John for the readers so that they can go from my introductory remarks to your more profound ones.
Thank you for that. I actually know David. David runs the journal Sim Philosophie, I believe. Yes.
Is
Very,
involved.
yeah, very kind person and a very great scholar. It's interesting that you brought up John, because John is the logos. The logos, the logic, and also Schelling at the end in the late 1840s brings up the Church of St. John and this kind of political, theological. It's so interesting that both Fichte and both Schelling kind of have this. I mean, Schelling's philosophy.
Joachim de Fior, and you get this in Fichte and Schelling at some point. In the characteristics of the present age, when Fichte is talking about history, at some point he goes off on a tangent, starts talking about the state, and then starts talking about the church. Then he winds up saying that the church of the past, the Roman church, the Catholic church, remember he's a Lutheran in Germany, and he considers Luther as being historical progress for the development of humanity. So he sees the Church of Peter as being the church of the past. And then the church of the present, the Church of Luther, being the Church of Paul. And the church of the future, the prophetic church, is the Church of John. And Schelling would agree with this, I'm completely sure. Sean McGraw, both our friends, has written about this and just runs with it, because this image in German idealism, the Church of John, and John as the eschatological figure, but also the figure of the Logos, the Platonic philosopher of the evangelists, there's something there that the German idealist tradition latches onto.
Very well, profound, like very profoundly stated. It seems like, so if Fichte had lasted, let's say, 3 or 4 more years, how do you think he would have finally finished a work of the Wissenschaftslehre? Said, yes, now my system is complete. It's funny. I interviewed Babbage yesterday for a video on the life and philosophy of Nietzsche. And I asked her at the end, and she kind of went, well, you're throwing me a hardball here. I asked her, I said, do you think, what would Nietzsche's transvaluation of all values be? Her being a Nietzsche scholar. She gave me this lovely answer. And I thought today, this morning, when I woke up, I said, I'm going to ask Matthew today if Fichte had finished the Wissenschaftslehre, because you've written such a brilliant book. It's such a great book, and highlighting all phases of Fichte, seriously, and really shedding light on a lot of great things. And I really hope a lot of people buy this book. It's not very expensive. It's perfect for the student, and great publisher as well. So what would Fichte's Finnish Wissenschaftslehre look like if it could be done?
I love this question. This is the best question anybody's asked me about Fichte, bar none. And I'm going to throw a semi-Schellingian answer at you, because my answer I'm going to take out of the page of Xavier Tilliet, who is the great Schelling scholar, biographer, wrote a 2-volume French work on Schelling that's bar none the most thorough scholarship on Schelling, even today, still, even if it was written in 1970. And in an article from I don't know when, Tilliet wrote so much. Tilliet said that if Fichte had lived as long as Schelling, he would have completed the system of German idealism. That's Xavier Tilliet. I'll find the quote. We can put the quote somewhere in the comments. More or less, I might be slightly paraphrasing, but something about it. Fichte lived as long as Schelling, he would complete the system of German idealism. Because you see this progression, and Tilliet brings this out in the same article, of you have this famous moment of seeing when Fichte gets to Berlin, where he starts to say, well, you know, our seeing God is God seeing us, and it's because God sees us first that we can see him. And that's you know, this moment of reason having us and us not having reason. That's his answer to Jacobi. This moves on, and by the time you get to 1812, you have not just a philosophy of seeing, but a sort of philosophy of living as living. So 1812 is the last complete version of the Wissenschaftslehre. There's an incomplete one in 1813. It's left unfinished because of a war. There are drafts and fragments from 1814 that are left. It wasn't incompleted because of Fichte's death. But if he would have lived as long as Schelling, I think he would have died in 1834. I did the math at some point. And I think he would have seen the concept of life become the central concept of the Wissenschaftslehre. And it's not for no reason that the French phenomenologist Michel Henry was a big fan of Fichte. And his Christian philosophy is, I am the life, moi c'est la vie. And I think that you would have had a philosophical system of German idealism based on the concept of life that's living itself, and would be pretty close to a kind of complete system of German idealism, if there is such a thing. No.
Well, I think you did a great job with that question. I kind of threw that right at you. The book comes out May 6th, I believe.
May 7th.
May 7th. I will definitely purchase a copy of it. Looks fantastic. I want to thank you so much for being here and going through this lovely text. One last question, just for the viewers, do you have a new project right now? Are you working on any papers? Are you working on a new book? Just so everyone can hear what the next project is.
You're smirking because I think you know the answer. I'm writing a book on Schelling, and I'm writing a book that is struggling with the fragments of the ages of the world, that begins with the freedom essay, goes to the Erlangen lectures in 1821 with the ages of the world as the meat, the main piece. And I'm asking the question of what is a beginning? How do we begin with Schelling? So Schelling and the question of the beginning is what I'm working on now.
And that will be just as great as this text here. So I want to thank you so much for coming here, doing this kind of special presentation on your text, sharing it with me, of course. I got to view it before it came out. Thank you so much. And your answers were fantastic. I think this is really, really good that you know, now that the video is out, viewers can now read the book and have so much insight from you here as well too. So that's a bonus.
I'm available for questions if anyone needs to know anything. This is what Fichte did, and I'll do it too.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you so much, and can't wait for the book to come out. And I will give you a complete. I'll write you an email about all of what I finally think at the end, because it's fantastic so far.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.